Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today and welcome to our webinar series, which is aimed to support decision making for on-farm water storage. This webinar series is part of the Efficient Water Use project, which is delivered by Pinion Advisory in conjunction with the TAS Farm Innovation Hub and is made possible due to funding from the Australian Government's Future Drought Fund. So earlier this year, we gathered groups of Tasmanian farmers together to capture information from them about what their priority needs were relating to water use on farm. And one common theme which emerged was the need for support in navigating the processes for planning on-farm water storage. So the processes behind farm dam applications and applying for water licenses can be really complex, and farmers were looking for information about where to start and where to go to find out more information and some support. So this webinar series has developed out of the need articulated by Tasmanian farmers around the state. Today we deliver webinar 1, which is part of that 2-part series, and today we focus on that dam construction planning phase. Whilst broadly dam construction planning will be covered today in webinar 1, and then water licensing in part 2 next week, the two topics do have overlap. So you might find information relating to either topic both today and also next week in webinar 2. But by the end of this 2-part series, we will have covered the process involved in planning on-farm storage, seeking a permit for a dam construction, and how that's linked to water allocations and water licensing processes. And during webinar 2, we'll also do a live demo of the water assessment tool, which demonstrates how we would use that to determine water availability. The information that we share both today and next week relates to regulations and processes, which can all be found on the Department of Natural Resources and Environment website. We'd like to acknowledge the support and expertise of NRE representatives Bill Shatcliffe and Henry Maxwell, both who are joining us online today and will be available to answer questions that you might have. And if you'd like to access information from NRE after the webinar, we suggest you go to their website, which is nre.tas.gov.au/water. So just a bit of housekeeping. Today we are delivering this webinar via the Zoom platform. We're recording the webinar to enable us to share the information with others later. If you do not wish to be identified on the recording, we suggest you turn your cameras off, and you can do that using the toolbar down the bottom. We're asking that you please keep your microphones on mute. And again, that's in the bottom toolbar on the left. That'll just prevent background noises being distracting for others. There is a chat function, which you can use to type any questions that you have throughout the webinar. I'll be keeping an eye on that chat function. And if there's a simple answer to your question, we'll type that in there. But otherwise, we'll open it up for questions as the webinar progresses. There is a function that you can use under the reactions emoji, which is also on the toolbar at the bottom, where you can choose to raise your hand. That will just alert us to the fact that you've got a question that you would like to ask. So there's 2 members of the Pinion Advisory team delivering these webinars, James Curran and Alastair Brooks. Both James and Alastair regularly support Tasmanian landowners in this dam construction water licenses space. James manages Pinion's water resource development team, and he's got many years' experience in irrigation design and water resource management. Alastair Brooks leads the water monitoring and operations team. Alastair also supports lots of farmers around the state in that water resource management area, specialising in water development projects and water monitoring. James and Alastair will be sharing their insights into the dam construction and water licensing processes, and providing advice about where to go to find more information or support if you do decide to go down this path with your business. Okay, so now I'm going to hand over to James.
Thank you, Jo. I'll just, hopefully this works as intended. We good? Excellent.
All good, James.
Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for coming along today, and hopefully everyone gets out of it what they need. And just to reiterate on what Jo said, if you've got any questions, please ask them as we go along, or we will have a question session at the end if they can wait to then. In addition to Alice and myself today, we also have Bill Shacloff, who's the section head of Water and Dam Administration, sitting in on this webinar, as well as Henry Maxwell, who's the coordinator of water licensing and dam permits. So anything that Alice and I find a bit too curly with regard to the process and regulations, we'll defer you to those guys, and I'm sure they'll correct both myself and Alistair on our errors in the knowledge and process. So yeah, welcome to those two guys. Righto. So today we're going to broadly cover the process for dam permitting.
Let me get into this.
Sorry. Yep. Which, generally speaking, we're going to just work through engaging with a consultant to support the process, identifying water availability, going to have a broad overview of the application process and submission, dam classifications, engaging with contractor, and dam completion. So why is this important? As part of Pinion's work with this overall project, the early parts of the project focused on working with focus groups of producers, amongst others, and other key stakeholders across the state to identify some of the priorities with regard to water use efficiency. One of the factors that came up repeatedly was the need for better knowledge with regard to on-farm water storage options, planning, etc., and particularly around, you know, what do you do to build a dam? How do you get a water license? How do you get a dam permit, that sort of stuff. There was a lot of feedback saying that that was very challenging, and it was challenging to find the appropriate information and support. So hence, you know, the where do I start type questions. So as noted in those dot points there, it's a regulated space. There's the Water Management Act 1999 sitting in the background, plus other regulations that flow into that. And, you know, it is quite complex, so it can be quite challenging for the uninitiated to navigate their way through this. So the idea of these sessions is to provide that overview of the information available to support producers navigating this space with regard to dam permits and water licensing. Additionally, there's some newly developed outputs with regard to some quick guides, case studies that have been developed as part of this project for producers. And Jo will put some links up later in this webinar with where to find them. And hopefully at the end of today's webinar and next week's webinar, everyone will feel a little bit more confident and informed with regard to the process. So the first thing that I would say is it's pretty much impossible to navigate this process without engaging someone who knows it well. So realistically, you do need to engage with a consultant. The consultant will help you through the process. The nature of the applications are such that it is pretty much impossible for a lay person to complete them for various reasons. So first thing is, yeah, I'm finding a suitable person to help you. The various consultants that are out there are contained in a list compiled by NRE. We generally recommend that you should be working through your selection of that consultant by having a good understanding of their knowledge, skills, experience across the various aspects. And we'd normally say, have a look at their recent work, get some references, find out who's doing the work. There's a lot of consultants on the list. Not all of them are active in the space regularly, so there is quite a difference in the knowledge and experience within those consultants on the list. Did we want to share that list, Jo?
We'll put that with the other resources,
We'll put it with other resources, yeah, because it's quite an extensive list. There's a lot of companies and individuals on there, and all I would say exactly that is, before you pick your service provider, do your homework, talk to your neighbours, talk to other people that have been through the process, find out who they're using, and do your homework. It makes a big difference getting the right consultant to help through the process. Once you've decided that you're going to get down this path and engage with a consultant, the first thing that is generally asked or should be asked is, where is the water going to come from that's going to fill the dam? When we're working with our clients, that's our first question is, okay, someone will ring us up, they want to build a dam. We'll generally sit there and go, okay, where's this going to be filled from? Is there water available in the catchment? Is the water coming from an adjacent catchment? Is it coming from a scheme? Where's the water coming from? So without there being water to fill the storage, there's not much point having the storage. So that's the first thing that we generally look at. So as part of that, we would normally run a water assessment tool off for the site to make sure there's water available. Now, we're not going to delve into that too much today at all, really. That's going to be outlined with a lot of detail in the second webinar. So we'll leave most of that discussion for the webinar next week. But that should be your first question that you're asking with your consultant, and certainly should be the first thing that you need to ascertain that you do have adequate resource. One of the things that I see quite regularly, I'm sure Alistair does as well, as no doubt Bill and Henry do, is there's plenty of water running down my creek, or there's plenty of water in the river. Just because you see plenty of it there running around doesn't mean it's available for allocation. It could be allocated to someone else further down the system, etc. So despite the fact that you can see plenty of water running around, doesn't mean that it is available for allocation. And as I said, that'll be covered in a lot more detail in next week's webinar. The other part of that I would say is that some areas of the state are also covered by water management plans, which set the limits and conditions around water allocation. So it is a complicated space that is somewhat challenging to navigate, even for people like myself and Alistair, who are doing it all the time. So dams generally fall into two categories of permits. We either have a Division 4 permit or a Division 3 permit. The classification of those into Division 3 or Division 4 is based on the potential risk, if you like. So lower risk dams, those that have less potential for harm to the environment, to others, that sort of stuff, will sometimes fall into the Division 4 category, which is simpler, and quicker to get approved. Those dams that are deemed to be higher risk generally fall into Division 3. The criteria that sets those two apart from each other is spelled out in detail in the water assessment framework, which we will have a quick look at a little bit later in these slides. But essentially, in a really broadly speaking, Division 4 dams are generally off stream, so not on a recognised watercourse or a watercourse that meets the definition under the Act. That can be both permanent or ephemeral in nature. So it's got to be off stream, generally doesn't impact any threatened vegetation or species, and isn't in the coastal zone, as well as a few other factors. So generally, Division 4 dams more or less are dams in the landscape that aren't on a watercourse, that don't really impact much at all. If they sit in that, then they're a lot quicker and at lower cost to approve. The other factor for Division 4 dams is the consequence category has to be at the lower end of the scale. So the consequence category is an assessment of the likely impacts of a dam failure. So they have to essentially not result in an elevated consequence category. Everything else fits in the Division 3 categories. So the way that we would normally work through the process is when we get an inquiry for a dam permit or dam application, water licence application, we would generally undertake an initial desktop review of the site with the client. So Alice and I will ask questions such as, where are you? We'd try and locate the property on list map. We would then try and locate the general location of the dam. If the client has a location in mind, if it's broader than that, then we'll work through what the most suitable locations are likely to be. We will use a number of layers on list map to make some preliminary desktop assessments with regard to the suitability of the site. That may or may not lead us to the particular site that the client's got in mind. Often we'll end up looking at something slightly different that for various reasons we've identified would be more suitable. Once we've done that, we'll either do one or two things. We'll either do some initial 3D modelling before we go to site, but more often than not, we'll arrange a site visit with the client to physically inspect the site and understand exactly what is impacted by the proposed dam. Part of that process will be conducting some survey. More often than not these days, we tend to go the full hog and do really good assessment on site with regard to collection of levels, survey data, etc. Part of that site visit is also to inspect the vegetation that's impacted and any other relevant factor that we need to. From there, we will go and do the 3D modelling using the survey information collected and/or available LiDAR information to provide accurate values with regard to the storage volume and the earthworks volume for the dam. From a permit point of view, the requirement from the regulator, from DNRE, is that dams over 100 megalitre need to be modelled and surveyed accurately to provide accurate numbers with regard to storage volumes, etc. What we generally find these days is that most of the contractors that are out there building the dams, they want accurate numbers on the earthworks, regardless of the size, so that they can quote the dam accurately. So even for the small dams now, we're more often than not doing full models, because if we don't do it at the permit stage, what we find is that once it gets to construction, we're finding the contractors are contacting us wanting it surveyed and modelled, so they've got accurate numbers anyway. So it's a lot easier to just do it up front, get good values. That makes the whole costing of the project better from the get-go, and it inevitably needs to be done more often than not anyway. Probably the only exception to that would be the very, very small sort of stock water holes probably fall outside that, but there's not too many of them that we're doing these days. The other thing that gets done relatively early in that process, for us at least, is we would undertake a preliminary assessment of the dam consequence category. Now, the reason we do that very early is the consequence category, as I said previously, is an assessment of the consequence of a failure. It's not the risk of the failure. It's just if the dam was to fail, what would be impacted? Would it cause or have potential to cause loss of life? Would it impact other infrastructure, etc.? So that consequence category details whether detailed engineering design is required. So if detailed geotechnical and dam engineering design is required, that needs to be done to support the application. So as a result of that, we want to identify that very early in the process, because that can take several months to get completed. By the time you engage a suitably qualified engineer, they go to site, collect material for testing, do the geotechnical investigation, material gets run through the lab, it comes back. That can take a relatively long time. It's not uncommon for that to take 3 to 6 months just to get the engineering work done. So that is often one of the biggest chokes, if you like, on time. So what we generally want to do is identify that very early in the process. Identifying it early in the process, it gives us more time to get it dealt with and to deal with anything else that crops up. So that's the other thing that we generally do quite early.
Can I just add a little bit to that, James?
Absolutely.
Yeah, just with that consequence category assessment, just give you a couple of examples. So a dam out in, well away from roads and houses, say several kilometres, would be very low consequence category, and it might say a 100 meg dam, for example. But if it was to be in an area where there's a road downstream, like a major road or some houses, as James was saying, we have to do that consequence category assessment to determine whether that category will go up from, say, very low to some of the higher categories, which then, as James said, would determine engineering. And quite often dams will jump up to what we call the significant category, which is the first level of trigger for engineering. But if they do jump up to the high C category, the next category up, that then brings in a lot more issues around the requirement, say, for a dam, sand filter in the wall, and the cost will go up quite dramatically if that's the case. So that's another reason why we do that consequence category assessment early on, because if a dam site was to jump up to that high C category, it might be a potential showstopper for the farmer not to go ahead because of the cost. Where if it sits in that significant category, it will require some engineering, but it's still probably doable from a cost perspective for the landowner. So I just thought I'd give you that as an example, because, as I say, as James said, that's one of the reasons why we do that consequence category assessment fairly early on.
Thanks, Alistair. That's great. So basically, in addition to the engineering, which is often required, additional assessments that may or may not be required, that are all outlined within the assessment framework, which we'll sort of have a look at in a second, can include things such as, you know, flood modelling, threat and vegetation community assessments with offsets, detailed fauna and flora surveys, acid sulphate soil assessment, river flood flow impact, salinity soil assessment, landslip risk, coastal zone impact assessment, Aboriginal heritage, sedimentation, erosion control plans, etc. There's quite a lot that sits under the framework. I might just, hopefully this works, open up the framework for everyone to see, and I won't try and go through it all because it's a fairly lengthy document, but the framework does set out the requirements for a Division 3 application or Division 3 works permit. Likewise, it sets out the requirements for dams that fit under the Division 4 works permits. So again, I won't go through each dot point. Everyone can find this information. We'll make sure there's links to it, and it's reasonably simple to read through. So we'll go through. Then once you're looking at a dam, there's the actual framework. So under the framework, it basically meets the requirement of box A or it doesn't. So in this instance, public safety, if the dam works are under 10 metres maximum height and classified as low or very low, it meets the requirement of box A, in which case it wouldn't require detailed engineering design. If it didn't meet those requirements, then it ends up being box B, so pre-construction report, etc. And that is set out for all these various aspects. So you've got, as I said, landslide, sedimentation, erosion control, acid sulphate soils, salinity soils, coastal zone, etc. Now, one of the things that is really good with that, it's a really clear framework, as you can see. By having that really clear framework there, we can work through it with a high degree of certainty around the outcome when preparing the application. So if we can work through that for our client and deal with any of the requirements that are spelled out, then by the time we have the full application compiled and submit it to the department, we can submit it with a high degree of certainty that it will be approved or not. And generally speaking, you know, if there's things come up that we know that are going to cause issues, then there's no point submitting the application. So we generally wouldn't. But what we do try to do with that whole process is, from the very get-go, is skim through that framework, make sure that there's nothing there that is going to be impossible to deal with. If we start hitting major roadblocks when we're looking at a particular site for our clients, then what we would normally do is look at alternative sites, because often when you start hitting those major roadblocks, it becomes A, very expensive to get from A to B. Two, it may just simply be impossible. So what we'd normally do is work through that, make sure that we can deal with anything that's going to crop up. And as I said, having that framework there gives us the structure with which to make those judgments on behalf of our clients. And then ideally, when we get to the end of it all, we've dealt with it adequately, and by the time it lands on Bill and Henry's desk, they've got a application that meets all their requirements, that makes their task of providing approval relatively straightforward. That's the theory. Doesn't always work like that, but we do generally manage to do it pretty okay most of the time.
I'll just give a little example of a showstopper potentially, a threatened native species So if you go to a dam site and it's it's got native timber on it, say there's ovata, which is a threatened native eucalypt species, it's swift parrot habitat, that potentially is a showstopper. It's a federally listed threatened community, and yeah, it's pretty difficult to get a dam site through the system, if you like, when there's ovata on the site, just as an example. There's not a huge amount of showstoppers, but that would be one.
Sometimes, however, there can be issues there, but we can see there's a way to navigate through it. So in the case of threatened vegetation communities, for instance, it is possible in some circumstances to provide offsets for that. So if we can, identify that there is potential for offsets, then often we'll work through that process with the client. It's a case of, really understanding, what can and can't be done. And that's one of the things that we generally do is have a good look at all these things, like I say, at the very get-go, and try and understand what is or isn't possible. And, ideally get to the point where time we get to the end of it and have the full application complete, that we have a lot of certainty around what the outcome will be before it's lodged. And it's not too often that we get caught. With regard to the dam permit application, once it's compiled and complete with all the elements, which aren't just the application form, it's the application form. It'll be all the relevant supporting information. So essentially, we have to go through and address all the items within that framework. It also has to have the consequence category assessment done, and the consequence category assessment can't be done by just anybody. So it has to be done by someone suitably qualified and experienced to do that. So once we've got a complete application compiled, we will generally provide that back to the client for them to sign and formally submit. We submit all the supporting information with it. It then goes into the department for essentially a compliance check, and Bill or Henry will correct me if I get this wrong in the terminology and the process, but essentially before they can accept it, they have to go through the documentation and make sure that it meets the relevant criteria for a complete application. So that may take, might be quite quick, may take some time. Once it's accepted for a Division 3 dam permit, the applicant will be notified that it's going to be advertised. It gets advertised. There's a 14-day representation period. Once that period's over, then it goes through the proper assessment within DNRE, which can take up to 12 weeks. Division 4 dams, however, a little bit different. They go to the department, need to be assessed that they're complete, and then once they're accepted, then it's a 14-day approval process. The Division 3 dam permits are valid for 2 years with the option for a 2-year extension. The Division 4 permits are valid for 2 years, no extension. Bill and Henry aren't jumping in, so I mustn't have stuffed that up too much.
Just a quick comment. If there's engineering required for a dam, that also has to be done before or as part of the submission for the application. So if a pre-construction report needs to be done because the consequence category is higher or the dam's above a certain size, then that all has to be done as well. So that I suppose the department, Henry and Bill, that are assessing these, and everybody else in the department, want a complete package of information. We can't, probably in the old days, we used to submit probably half the required information, and then they would issue a notice for additional information. That's sort of no longer. We basically, as consultants, now have to make sure we submit it all up front, and then they can consider that as a complete package.
Yeah, and that's essentially what the framework provides. The framework is there to provide that guidance, so that if we're assisting the owner with the process, it's up to us to use that framework look at what's going to be required, ensure that any additional studies, be they engineering, threatened species surveys, acid sulfate soil investigation, whatever it may be, it's up to us to ensure that they are done and that they are part of the submission to support and accompany the application. If we leave any of those out, then essentially the application wouldn't be deemed complete, so therefore it can't be accepted. So it just effectively returns to sender, doesn't go anywhere, doesn't even get advertised without it. So that all needs to be done to support the application. Once you have your permit, we generally say to people, you need to go and find, well, you do need to go and find a suitable earth moving contractor. One thing that I often say to people, however, is you need to find the right contractor, because the right contractor will make a huge difference. Now, not every earth moving contractor is a dam builder. There's a big difference between just moving dirt around and building a dam. So again, make sure you do your homework, talk to your neighbours, do your research, find the contractors out there that have the experience in building the dams. One of the things that goes along with that is, from a permit point of view, you are supposed to engage a dam construction contractor that has a minimum of 5 years experience building dams of the same height and consequence category as your proposed dam. So again, you know, if you're talking to your contractors, make sure that they do have plenty of experience. One of the things that we've seen over the years, more often than not, is, you know, we'll work with someone, they'll have their permit, they'll come back to us, talk to us for, you know, some detail or something, and then we'll find out they've engaged the guy down the road who's got a couple of excavators and a dozer to build the dam. But, you know, according to him, according to the contractor, he's built plenty of dams, but when you dig into it, you know, all he's done is, you know, dig out a couple of stock water holes, never really built dams, and that sends massive alarm bells for people like myself, because the quality of that contractor is huge when it comes to getting the outcome you want. So select the right contractor. If the dam needed geotechnical investigation and a pre-construction engineering report, it will most certainly need a supervising engineer as well. So you have to make sure that is done. Biggest thing is make sure you still have a valid permit. I've lost count of the number of times I've been rung up by a client at the last minute to get an extension because their permit's about to expire, or worse still, where they've engaged the contractor and then they found out the permit has already expired, and we've had to then go back and resubmit and do the whole process again for them. So that does happen. Understand the conditions that are on the permit. Again, a lot of people get their permit, get all excited, I've got a permit, and don't read and understand the conditions. So make sure that's right. The other big thing is, if it doesn't require engineering supervision and the dam is being built by the contractor, make sure the contractor is aware that they will have the responsibility for completing the as constructed paperwork. And that's a joint responsibility by the dam owner and the contractor, essentially, in that scenario. In order to do that, you do need adequate records during construction of the key events, which, again, you know, we tend to get the phone calls at the end of it. Oh, we've built this dam, we've now realised we've got to complete this paperwork, but we don't have photos, we don't have records. And they come to us looking for help, which is pretty hard for us to help people when they haven't kept any records themselves. So, like I say, with that, just be mindful when you're picking a contractor. DRNRE do have a list of contractors. There's some very good contractors on that list. There's some others that are probably not at the top of the list, shall we say. So just be mindful of that. As I sort of alluded to, during construction, you will need to keep records so you can complete your completion report. That paperwork is provided to you once you give your notice of intention to start works. You'll receive that from the department. So again, just to reiterate, it's about making sure that you've got adequate records during construction to be able to complete that paperwork. And again, it's a joint responsibility between the owner and the contractor.
I might just give a little example there, James.
Go for it, Alistair.
Sorry, that photo that's got gauge boards in it. If the dam's surveyed, generally with the survey, you'll get what is called a depth capacity curve or a storage curve. So at different levels of the dam, it'll tell you basically how much water's left in your dam. So if you put gauge boards in the dam and they're surveyed in to meet or to that survey that's been done of the dam, then at any time you know how much water's left in your dam by reading the gauge board, and it can be a really handy water balancing tool, I suppose, if you're a large irrigator. So you might say that dam in that photo is 100 megalitres, but 2 metres down from full supply, it might only be 30 megalitres. You know how much water you've got left in that dam. So a lot of people are starting to put gauge boards in their dam for that purpose. I just thought I'd mention that while that photo was up.
Yep. The only other thing I'd say of that is if you're going to do that, you really need a survey of the basin post-construction to get yes, that accurate, because that's it depends where the material's been moved out of the dam. Okay, some take-home messages. It is a complex process. It does need, or the property owner, dam owner, does need assistance to get the work done. Often it's a multidisciplinary team to do the work. You may need, a suitably qualified engineer, you may need a botanist, etc., soil specialist, it goes on. So, it's no one person's going to have all the relevant skills, qualifications, and experience to be able to do it. Simple dams, sometimes, yes, Alistair and I can do everything required on the simple dams, but as soon as they get complicated, as soon as we start hitting box Bs in that framework, then often it means bringing other people in. The best dam sites are those that can be approved and successfully built. That's a point I've made a lot over the years, that you may have a really good dam site on paper that gives you a fantastic volume and a fantastic volume for not a lot of earth, but if you can't ever get it approved, it's not actually a dam site. So it needs to be, buildable. Find the best construction contractor you can for the job. Cheapest isn't best. Again, I've seen plenty of cheap dams built that leak like a sieve, but I got it cheap. But they never fill up, because once they get 3/4 full, everything leaks. So you get what you pay for a little bit in this world, and that dams is certainly no exception to that. The process can take several months. It can be quite quick for some of the Division 4 stuff, but it can take several months for more complicated dams. If we have to start doing botanic surveys at certain times of the year, if we have to do detailed engineering design, all that sort of stuff, it can take, up to 12 months to complete, to get from, A to Z. So just be mindful of that. Next steps and opportunities. Were you jumping in here, Joe, to talk about this?
Sure can, James. Thank you.
Perfect.
I've just posted a link in the chat for everybody. So what's been created alongside these webinars are a couple of resources which are designed to help people at that entry level of this process. So there's a quick guide, which is that picture on the left-hand side of the slide, which just goes through the fundamental key steps of decision making when thinking about putting in a dam. And then there's also almost like a scenario case study of what that process might look like for a farmer who's thinking about putting a dam in. So both of those resources can be found on that link to the TAS Farm Innovation Hub website. Once you go on there, you scroll down a little bit, you'll see a variety of tiles, one of which is the on-farm water storage tile, and you'll find those resources under there. As the broader water use efficiency project rolls out, that website will be populated with a lot of other resources. So keep your eye on it as that unfolds.
Thank you, Jo. Questions?
So I've been keeping an eye on the chat, James. There's none in the chat, so we've got time for people to unmute and ask their questions if anyone has any. All good. So no specific questions. Obviously, next week we have part 2, which relates more to the water assessment tool and water licensing. So there will be an opportunity to ask more questions as well as they arise through the process.
Okay. Any final thoughts, Alistair?
It's the next slide. Is that on the water licensing? Yeah.
Not quite.
Next slide.
Yeah. So we've got the feedback, which I think you were going to.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So guys, we'd really appreciate, this is a 1-minute survey just to capture your feedback from today. If you wouldn't mind scanning that with your mobile phone, that will take you straight to a Google Forms where you can leave your feedback on today. And it will also give the opportunity for you to be added to our database if you wanted to hear of other activities and resources related to water use. That would be really great.
Thank you. And Alistair?
Yeah, so as James and Jo mentioned, next week, same time on Tuesday, we're going to talk about the water licensing process. And as James mentioned at the start, there's a fair bit of overlap between the water license process and the dam process, but they are 2 separate processes. So that's why we thought we'd split them out into 2 sessions. So we'll talk about that. James has mentioned a couple of times the water assessment tool, which is effectively an online modelling tool that the department have made available to consultants to I suppose initially have a look at what water is likely to be available at a particular location on a water course, and then from there we'll talk about the process of how we go about that assessment. And as Jo said, I think we'll also show a bit of an online example of how we do that using the actual tool itself. Go to the next slide. Yeah, actually, there's the points we'll cover. So we'll talk about what is a water license versus an allocation, when's a license required, obtaining a water license, talking a little bit about surety levels that are shown on a water license. We'll mention hydro catchments and water management plans and how they govern to a degree whether water can be allocated in those catchments. A little bit of general information about water licensing, and then, as I said, we'll do that live demonstration on the Watt tool at the end. So that's next week at 12 o'clock. Perfect.
And the same Zoom link and password apply from today to next Tuesday. So you don't need a second link. Fabulous. All right. Well, if there's no last minute questions or queries, thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks also to the support and help from Department of Natural Resources and Environment. I did put in the chat, you'll find the link to the NRE website, which does have all of those resources and links that Alistair and James referred to. And the new resources which have been designed to help farmers, you'll find on that TAS Farm Innovation Hub website. Feel free to shoot us an email if you would like a copy of anything. We can send out hard copies of the quick guide and the case study if you would like it. We're very happy to post those out, so just send us an email. Thanks again and enjoy the rest of your Tuesday.